Jeremy Dronfield, welcome to Life in a Garden Online. It's fantastic to have you here this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been about 2 months in the making. I was trying to get hold of you before the lockdown happened, and luckily with lockdown, authors are far more accessible.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you for having me. I'm always very happy to talk to readers.
And we're very happy to have you here, although not a fabulous subject to be talking about.
Well, no, it's a tough subject, yeah.
Jeremy, how did you, well, before we even begin with that, where do you hail from?
Well, I was born in South Wales, born and grew up there. Now, but I've past 30 years, I've lived in Cambridgeshire.
Because you don't speak like a Welshman.
No, well, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, my Welsh accent was one of the many things I forgot at university.
Well, at least we can understand you then. Makes life a lot easier if I can understand what you're talking about. And your folks, and are they also all Welsh, or do they hail from somewhere else?
Yeah, well, my family background is half Welsh, half English. Yeah, partly, well, very much Northern English, the Dronfield side.
Jeremy, are you Jewish?
No, I'm not. It is unusual for a Holocaust history to be written by a non-Jewish author, and I think probably a lot of people may perhaps assume that I am, because my mother gave her children all Hebraic names, even though we've got no Jewish heritage. But I was slightly anxious when the book was first coming out, because I was aware that this could be a sensitive issue. But I've had no query, no pushback, no controversy at all, which I've been very relieved, and I feel kind of privileged, because I mean the Kleinman family welcomed me in, trusted me with their story, and I feel doubly privileged because it's not my heritage. And I think it kind of made it, in some ways it helped in writing the book, because I was able to feel, I was kind of able to bring an authorial detachment to the subject, because I have no family connection to the Holocaust or to Jewish history, so therefore perhaps I wasn't bringing any personal baggage to the story. It was entirely the Kleinman's own story. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. There was a lot of actually blowback, because the lady who wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz, she wasn't Jewish, and she got there was a lot of flack about that from, I think, the Jewish community. They feel that stories like this should be written by Jews. But I'm inclined to agree with you. By being non-Jewish, you can actually take a step back and, and literally be sort of more pragmatic about the whole thing without investing your emotional into it. Taking that even into account, it still must have been quite an emotional, wrenching thing to be reading that and be involved with it.
Yes, I mean, it was a very challenging book to write emotionally.
Yo, hang on, I don't know where that's coming from. There we go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, as you can imagine, it's a very challenging subject to write as an author, and especially when a part of the project was about writing it for the family, especially for Kurt Kleinman, who's the last surviving member of the wartime generation of the Kleinmans. And it was so important to him to get the story out, and I know that it had been extremely important to his brother Fritz to get their story out and to contribute to Holocaust history and to educate the public generally, and specifically about the Kleinman family's story.
Lest we forget.
So it carried that weight, and also I dug deep into the research and uncovered things that I knew Kurt didn't know, and possibly even Fritz himself may not have known about the context of their concentration camp experience. But most movingly, what happened to their mother, Gustav's wife Tini, and their younger daughter Herta, were murdered by the Nazis in 1942. And obviously Kurt knew that his mother and sister had been killed, and he had even visited the memorial at Mali Trostenets near Minsk. But he knew nothing about the exactly how it had happened. And I knew that when he read the first draft manuscript, he would be learning about these details for the first time, as well as a whole swathe of other details about his father's and his brother's experiences. And I've said before that I felt when I sent him that first draft, it felt almost as if I was sending him a ticking time bomb, because the impact it was likely to have on him. And he did tell me later that he was devastated by it, and he broke down when he read this. But at the same time, he was glad to know it, because he wants to know everything there is to know about the Holocaust generally, and especially about his family's experiences.
Does he have, in your opinion, I mean, this is a sort of a qualified question, do you think he has survivor's guilt?
I'm not sure with regard to his family. I'm not sure. So, as you all know, of his immediate family, his father and brother and elder sister survived. His mother and his second sister were murdered, but he lost many other family members that he was fond of. But I think the only trace I've ever detected of what you might call survivor guilt is in relation to the other children who didn't get out. And he managed to escape amongst this very small batch of children who were allowed into the United States in 1941. He came over with two other children, one from Vienna, one from Stuttgart, a boy and a girl. And he was under the impression that a large number of children would be escaping at the same time, but none turned up at Lisbon. And thereafter, he felt an eerie feeling that he was one of the last children to escape. And decades later, when he began contacting other survivors from that group of children, and discovered that only 1,200 unaccompanied children altogether had made it to the United States, he was really quite deeply upset about that. And I think there is possibly is a trace of guilt that he made it out, that so many other children didn't, and also that he had such a good life when he came to the US, and he was placed with a very kind, loving family in Massachusetts, and he was welcomed in. It was in a town with a very large and active Jewish community that he was welcomed into, and became almost a celebrity locally, and was very well looked at, very nicely brought up. But a lot of other children didn't have that experience, even the ones who made it out, who made it to America. When he met them later, he learned of stories of them suffering anti-Semitism, anti-German feeling, being placed with abusive families. So, yeah, I think he feels both very lucky, and I think there's possibly a trace of guilt. Yeah.
He's just turned 90, is that correct?
Yes, but back in January. Yeah, so he'll be 91 next January, and still in astonishingly good health. Very, very lively, a remarkable man.
I watched part of the interview that you did with him for Penguin on YouTube. If anybody wants to watch it, it is there. I'll post the link on the group later. And he's very well spoken, very, he's robust. He certainly doesn't look like a man in his 90s.
Yeah, see, he had a bit of a downturn in his health earlier this year, but has really bounced back, and seems to be coping very well with lockdown as well.
I'm coping very well with lockdown. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Unlike a lot of other people. How did you get involved with the project, and how far back was it that you got involved?
It was about 6 or 7 years ago now. What had happened was that Fritz Kleinman and an academic friend at Innsbruck University had put together a book in the 1990s, which consisted of Gustav Kleinman's concentration camp diary and a short memoir text by Fritz, and together with academic notes by this friend of Fritz's. And they had an English translation made, and they were trying to, and this was after Fritz had died. His friend, Reinhold Gärtner, was trying to find a publisher for this English translation, and I was asked to try and help. I mean, besides being a writer, I also do publishing consulting, book consulting. I help other authors present and package and shape their books to attract publishers. And we couldn't find a publisher for it because I'm as fantastically important a document as it is. Gustav's diary is incredibly difficult to read. He never really wrote it intending it to be read. It wasn't a literary work. It wasn't a straight record of his experiences.
It's cryptic in the way it's written.
Yeah, it's filled with very oblique references to people and places and events, and even a Holocaust historian would struggle to follow it without frequently consulting their reference books. So, but having read it myself and encountered that central event, the event that ultimately gave my book its title, Fritz's decision to go with his father to Auschwitz, and the incredible story of the sheer length of time that they survived and what they went through, I felt this was a story that had to be made public. So I felt the best thing I could do was to bring my abilities as a researcher and a writer and turn it into a book that would be accessible for anyone. And so I began doing preliminary work towards that, and it was still a struggle to find a publisher. Practically every publisher on both sides of the Atlantic turned it down. And I was told, the feedback was always the same. This is an amazing story, but there's no market for it. I mean, we can't sell Holocaust stories. This was before the Tattooist of Auschwitz became so successful. And eventually it only got published because a tiny independent publisher in Chicago picked it up. And they only took it because the commissioning editor, it was the descendant of Holocaust survivors, and he felt a personal stake in publishing this story. So if it hadn't been for him, this book would never have seen the light of day.
There seems to be a wealth of Holocaust books coming out at the moment. What do you think that's from?
Well, I think, initially from two things. I think there's a lot of it is, in purely crass commercial terms, a lot of it is cashing in on the success of The Tattooist, and to an extent, the success of my book. But it's deeper than that. It's the time for these stories. Well, I mean, we're living in a time where a number of countries are either sleepwalking in some cases, or in other cases striding vigorously towards fascism. The story of the Holocaust feels more relevant than it has possibly at any time since it finished. And also, I think in the case of possibly in the case of The Tattooist of my book, I think people are drawn to the idea that you can have, that something that terrible can happen, but that survival can still occur. There can still be hope. I think that's why those particular books have been so popular. but it's all about, for me, when I was writing it, I wanted to say something about the times we're living in now. This is why I brought in, I rather than just focusing on Gustav and Fritz's story, I wanted to bring in the whole family, and I wanted to bring in Kurt's experience and his sister Edith's experience in England as a refugee. Because in digging into those stories, I found that Jewish refugees in the West, especially in America and Britain, were subjected to prejudice, hostility, and the newspapers and the right-wing politicians were saying exactly the same things about Jewish refugees in 1939, 1940, as are said now about Muslim refugees from the Middle East. Exactly the same words. And that struck me so powerfully. And that I felt that story, that side of the Holocaust really needed to be foregrounded in a way that it just generally hasn't been.
How much, I mean, clearly from the row of books behind you, there's a serious amount of research that went into the background of this book. And looking at your notes at the back, how many hours have you plugged into researching?
Well, the book took there were about 2 years part-time preliminary research and preparation, and followed by about a year of full-time, 7 days a week research and writing to do this. But it was a very heavyweight project because I was pursuing several different strands. And a lot of the source materials are in German. I mean, I can painfully pick my way through German sources.
Is your German much better now?
Well, no, not really. I mean, I had a fairly basic grasp of school level German to begin with, but then I had to pour my way through a lot of very obscure German language sources, and it didn't get any easier. Gustav's diary was the core source. I mean, that was inherently difficult to understand because of it's so obliquely written. But that formed the bedrock and the core of my research. Pulling the story together was largely achieved through trying to understand his diary and the translation. For an example comes very early in the diary, where Gustav is talking about what the jobs he and Fritz are being given in Buchenwald concentration camp. And after a couple of days, they're given jobs, they're assigned tasks. And the word he uses is Lorrefahrer, which the rough translation I'd been given translated as truck driver.
It sounds a bit responsible, doesn't it?
Yeah, which is literally what it means, what that would translate as, truck driver. And I thought, well, there's absolutely no way the SS is going to make 2 Jewish prisoners who've only just arrived in the camp. Well, they would never make Jewish prisoners truck drivers under any circumstances. But when they've only just arrived in the camp, so I dug into that, and it was a very long search before I discovered that Lorrefahrer in Buchenwald concentration camp were the slave laborers who pulled and pushed these rail-borne trolleys filled with stone uphill from the stone quarry to the building sites in the main camp. And that opened up a whole vista of what life was, just through researching that word. There's a whole vista of what the experience was for prisoners in Buchenwald. There would be 16 to 26 men on each of these trolleys, and I calculated that each one would contain about 4 tons of stone. And I managed to find other eyewitness sources that describe what it was like doing this, the haphazard way it was done, the lack of safety, the constant frequent injuries, and an injury effectively meant was most likely to mean death. And the fact that Gustav and Fritz went through this for the whole of that first winter, 1939 to 40, and survived. Just the fact that they survived that was extraordinary. Never mind what came after that. So from thereafter, that making my way through the diary in that way was a process of unlocking what the concentration camp existence was like for Gustav and Fritz individually and for prisoners generally. The whole thing began to come together. So just through piecing together that diary.
Those words, do they sort of like symbolize some kind of concentration camp slang, or like a whole new dictionary for life in concentration camps? Were there other words like that?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but it's what Gustav does is gives you this insight. There's one section of that really highlights things. It gives at the back of the diary was the one part of it that Gustav did actually intend to be literary. There's this long poem called Quarry Kaleidoscope, which is beautifully written in lovely scanning, rhyming German, and describes just day-to-day life in the Buchenwald stone quarry and the abuses that were done, and day in, day out. And all of this was completely new to me. And this is not really a side of the concentration camp phenomenon that really gets a lot of attention, is this daily grind, this constant up in the morning. And Fritz elaborated on this in his memoir and in interviews that he gave, that for prisoners, the concentration camp experience was this daily, day after day grind of being up and paraded and roll calls and work and work and work and roll calls and cleaning and shaving the heads and trying to keep clean the stink of unwashed uniforms in the bunk room at night. And that was the overriding impression for me. And all the time behind this routine is this constant threat that you could be next. You could be the next random murder, the next person shot for being forced to go over the sentry line, the next person to suffer a fatal accident, the next person just on a whim, just drowned in a foundation trench.
Okay, I'm kind of like silenced by that. I mean, it's you've brought it to life. It's very graphic, and it's horrible to think that people had to survive under those conditions. I mean, it's dreadful. It's more than horrible. It's horrific. How do you think that they survived? What was it about this father and son that kept them going?
They were both very different personalities. Gustav was a war veteran. He'd had a really tough time in the First World War in the trenches. He'd been wounded several times. He was highly decorated for bravery and had experienced trench warfare, the grind and the constant danger of that. But I think he got through the concentration camps possibly the same way that he would have got through trench warfare, that he had this incredibly placid personality, an incredible optimism. He seems to have been very calm, capable of taking things in his stride, adapting and believing in himself. And his diary is full, for time and time again, he writes that he is determined that he will survive, even near the end, in the last few weeks after the death marches, and people were dying around him, literally thousands and thousands every week, starvation and disease. He was still writing in his diary, every day I say a prayer to myself, Gusto, you will survive. You won't let the SS murderers beat you. And he always believed that. He occasionally refers to God being on his side. He wasn't a deeply religious man, but God does make appearances in the diary. And that helped him. Being with his son helped him, I think. But Fritz was an extremely different temperament. He didn't have his father's calm.
He seems like a bit of a hothead.
He was much more prone to anger. There are a couple of photos of him taken under Nazi authority. One was his so-called J card that was taken when he was turned 16 for his identity card in Vienna. And the furious glare he gives into, most people in those photos look either just blank or frightened. Fritz looks angry. And the same in the photograph that was taken of him in Buchenwald. He looks angry. And he had these eyes, incredible eyes, that sort of really burn into you. And this anger came out, eventually in Auschwitz when he determinedly got himself involved with the prisoner resistance in Auschwitz. Was involved in assisting with escapes. He wanted to fight back against the Nazis. And at one point, he even got as far as smuggling weapons into the camp because he was determined when the evacuation was about to happen. And he was determined that he would, if the SS were going to slaughter the last remaining prisoners, he wanted to be able to fight back. And this anger was something he never lost. And he grew up, when you think about it, he grew from boyhood to manhood in the concentration camps. They shaped him in a way. After the war back in Vienna, he was involved in beating up a local young man who had been a member of the Vienna SS. And he always kept this anger. It spoiled his life in a lot of ways. The after effects, presumably PTSD that he would have been suffering from. And he got married within a few months after returning from the camps. And he and his wife had a child, and they tried settling in Israel, but it didn't work out. And Fritz, at that time, Israel was really intensely at war, and military service was compulsory.
And nothing's changed.
Young men. Yeah, but for Fritz couldn't deal with that. He would have had an undiagnosed PTSD from his experiences. He just couldn't deal with being at war after the 5.5 years he had just been through. And he just served out his compulsory 2 years and went back to Vienna. His marriage broke down. And he had quite a troubled life in a way. And I think he only really started to pull things back together during the 1980s, when he first began to get involved in Holocaust education. And it was his friend Reinhold Gärtner who used to organize educational trips to Auschwitz, who got him involved, who asked him to come along and talk to the participants about his experiences.
Did he say what it was like going back to Auschwitz?
Awful. Well, just talking about it, he said he couldn't sleep the night before doing the initial talk. They put it together as a big thing. They got a local Viennese actor to read extracts from Gustav's diary, and Fritz was to give a talk. And he found it traumatizing because it was the first time really since, well, it was the first time he really dug into his experiences. He'd talked to other Holocaust survivors in the past, in the intervening decades, but he hadn't really, I don't think he had really personally faced up and gone back to his father's diary and written about it and really remembered it in detail. But he went through this public event and then went back every year. This became a regular thing. And as I say, he and his friend produced this book. Fritz gave many interviews. The last interview he gave was in I think 2007, a video interview, which was about 2 years before he died. And that anger was still there. It hadn't dimmed at all. You can see it, it's there in his face when he's describing what he went through. He'd never lost his anger. Gustav reassimilated himself back into Viennese society almost immediately after he got home. Fritz never really did.
That's to his nature, Gustav. He would have, being of that placid type nature, he would have actually settled back in, and he got married.
Yeah.
Did they have more children?
No, they did. I mean, they were both, I would think Olga herself would have been probably in her 50s by that point. Yeah, I mean, they'd been very old friends, he and Olga, and as you know from the book, Olga had helped him and Fritz to survive in the camps by sending smuggled food parcels. A remarkable one. One of the very small number of non-Jewish friends who stuck by the Kleinman family during the Holocaust. Most of their non-Jewish friends deserted them and even turned them in. I mean, they were, as you know, they were betrayed to the Nazis by these people who had been defriended, and these people who were close enough that they used the intimate form of you when talking to each other. Friends and neighbors turned the Kleinman family over. And they had no idea of the enormity of what they had done. This was part of what prevented Fritz from really reassimilating, is that these people couldn't understand why Fritz was angry with them after all this. I mean, Fritz heard people muttering, I see the Jew Kleinman is back. And they actually spoke to Gustav, some of these people, and said, why won't your son speak to us? They had absolutely no comprehension of what they had done. These people who had pointed out the Kleinman family to the SS as Jewish people, which had led to them being persecuted, murdered, sent away.
Jeremy, I'm going to ask you, sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to ask you to read a bit, and then I'd like to open the floor to some questions, because I'm sure that there are a lot of questions for you.
Right.
While Jeremy's looking for something to read, can we get a show of hands, just how many people have actually read the book already? You can just raise your hand on the Goody McGafter and I'll have a look at it. Okay.
The piece that I'm inclined to settle on, I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be able to read this. I'm sometimes asked, how was the book difficult to write? And to an extent, there's a kind of an authorial objectivity that, the technical concerns of writing a book, of getting everything sorted out, getting everything in place, kind of mediates between you and the subject matter. And that helps cushion you from it. But there's one section that I found incredibly difficult to write, and I still find difficult to talk about. And that was the episode when Tini and Herta were taken and killed. And while Kurt was away in America, Gustav and Fritz were in the camps. And I was working on this at the same time as I was reading the letters that Tini wrote to her son, Kurt. And the letters are so full of love and longing that it actually breaks me up still, just even thinking about it. And this is part of that episode. A summer sun lay hot and lazy on the slow-moving surface of the Danube Canal. The faint, delighted squeals of children drifted over the water from the grassy banks where families sat with picnics or strolled under the trees. Pleasure boats cruised and rowing boats scudded across the expanse between them. This is a flashback. This is something that was described in one of Tini's letters to Kurt. It was all far away from Tini's senses as she pulled on the oars, a pleasant, distant background music of laughter. Sunlight sparkled on the splashes with each lift of the oar blades from the water, illuminating the faces of her children. Edith smiling serenely, Fritz and Herta still little kids, and Kurt, the last born and beloved, a tiny speck scarcely out of nappies. Tinny smiled and heaved at the oars, sending the boat surging across the water. She was a good rower, had been since her girlhood, and she doted on her family. At the age of 12, she had been made a counsellor to the younger school children because she loved it so much. To nurture and succour was part of her makeup, and in motherhood it had its purest expression. The sounds of the other boats and the revels on the far banks faded as if a mist had descended, closing off the boat from the world. The oars dipped and splashed, and the boat glided on. In a drawer in the chest in faraway Massachusetts, Tinny's last letters to Kurt lay gathered. The German in which they were written was already leaking away from his comprehension as his child's mind adapted to his new world. He had absorbed her meaning, but was already slowly, insensibly beginning to forget how to read her words. My beloved Kurtle, I'm so happy that you are doing well. Write often. Herta is always thinking of you. I'm afraid every day. Herta sends hugs and kisses, 1,000 kisses from your mama. I love you. That night, after the Sonderkommando had backfilled the pit, dusk fell on the silent clearing among the young pines. Birds returned, night creatures foraged among the weeds and ran over the disturbed soil of the pit. Beneath lay the remains of 900 souls who had boarded the train in Vienna. Rosa Kerbel and her 4 grandchildren, Otto, Kurt, Helena and Heinrich, and the elderly Adolf and Amalie Klinger, 5-year-old Alice Barron, the spinster sisters Johanna and Flora Kaufmann, Adolf and Viti Aptowitzer from Imverd, Tinny Kleinman and her pretty 20-year-old daughter Herta. They had believed that they were going to eke out a new life in the Ostland, and that perhaps one day they would be reunited with their dear ones, husbands, sons, brothers, daughters, who had been scattered to the camps and far countries. Beyond all reason, beyond all human feeling, the world, not only the Nazis, but the politicians, people and newspaper men of London, New York, Chicago and Washington, had closed off that future and irrevocably sealed it shut.
Thank you. That was clearly hard for you to read.
Yeah.
Jeremy, did you have to have any therapy or like counseling after doing this?
No, I think it's kind of stayed with me. As I said, I mean that's an unusual episode, but I don't know why it gets to me quite so much. But as I said, there's a kind of a technical. The technical demands of writing a book are so intense that they tend to sort of you have to remain connected emotionally, otherwise the story just won't happen. It won't work for readers. But you're shielded to a certain extent. That episode, I find that separation of Kurt from Tinny, because they were such a loving family, and Kurt adored his mother so much, and he was, as they wrote, the youngest and beloved of the children. There's something so painful about the separation of them. To me, that ultimately, although the book is called The Boy Who Followed His Father into Auschwitz, and that is the core of the story, for me, ultimately, it's Tinny's story. It's the story of a mother trying desperately to keep her family together and failing. And she managed to save 2 of her children, and that was it. And I think the love in that family came ultimately from both Gustav and Tinny, but Tinny was the strength that held the family together. And for me, it's fundamentally her story. And I think that's partly why that passage gets me so much. And that Kurt was kind of her hope, because he was the only one, well, he was the most beloved, and he was the one who had got to the new world. And she still hoped, I think, at that point, at the time when she was writing the letters, she still hoped that they would all be reunited.
I think a lot of people hope they would be reunited afterwards. Jerry, you chose to write the book as a novel. Did you embroider anything at all
No,
instead of writing it as a biography?
I mean, it's pure non-fiction. I've written it in the style of fiction. It's in that kind of immersive style that you would get with a novel, because that's my background. I mean, I was originally an academic, then became a novelist, and so I combine those two. It's, you know, a novel writing instinct to immerse the reader and tell the story as vividly as I can and dramatically. But at the same time, my academic impulse is to make it is entirely solidly research-based. When I was first planning the book, I did consider writing it as a novel, because I thought, when I only had the diary, I thought I wasn't going to have enough material to make a structurally coherent non-fiction narrative. But as I did the research and I found Kurt and interviewed him and filled in all these gaps, I eventually realized I had more than enough material to make a fully coherent narrative, but without any fictional element in it. Now, everything in it is from original sources, even the dialogue. There are occasional passages of dialogue. Every one of those is either quoted directly from a primary source, the diary, Fritz's memoir, interviews, Kurt's recollections, or it's reconstructed from those sources. You know, I'm told that a conversation happened and that this was the gist of it. In those cases, that you can sometimes reconstruct the actual dialogue to bring it to life. But no, there is nothing embroidered at all.
When did Edith die?
She was also very long lived. She died in 2015. Yeah, she was 96.
Did you get a chance to speak to her, or was it already too late?
Really, really frustratingly, no. She passed away probably a few. Yeah, I think it was just a few months, literally, before I managed to find Kurt and get to know him. And it was a great shame, because I know that she would have had such a huge amount to contribute, and she would have loved so much to see the story being put out there. Yeah.
What was Kurt like when you approached him and said, "Hi, listen, this is what I'm doing"?
Very wary, and completely understandably. I mean, I was anticipating, you know, having to prove myself, and I mean, he wanted to know who I was, you know, what I had done. He wanted to tell his story. I didn't have to persuade him to tell his story. Sometimes, you know, subjects of, you know, prospective books do have to be persuaded, you know, to actually tell their stories. Kurt was very eager, and he'd spent many years talking publicly about his own story and trying to publicize his family's story. But he had no idea who I was. And I think it helped that I'd become friendly with Fritz's friend, Reinhold Gertner. And I came from him, in effect, so that helped. But it took many hours of conversation. And I think he only really finally accepted me once the book was published, I think. And he saw that I had done justice to the family. And that I'd actually fulfilled the promise of actually making it public. And as I was saying at the beginning, I mean, I feel privileged that I've been sort of admitted to the Kleinman family as a friend. The ultimate honor was when I first met Kurt in person in London nearly 2 years ago now. And I was saying how, for me, because I've been writing about him, and it was almost like meeting a celebrity for the first time. And he said that it was like meeting a new brother for him. And that just moved me so much, because to have been accepted in that way and been entrusted with their story, but also on another level, when I remember who his actual brother was, and that's incredibly humbling.
Well, it must be that's an incredibly powerful thing to say.
Yeah.
It was like meeting another brother. But I mean, you had an insight into his family that nobody else did.
Yeah.
You knew the family inside and out.
Yes, yeah. Most of my knowledge of what they were as a family came from Kurt. I mean, the book couldn't have been written. Well, yes, it possibly couldn't have been written at all, let alone been what it is, without Kurt's recollections. Because the core of the story is, as I was saying, about Tini as a mother trying to save her family. And my whole picture of what they were like as a family before Hitler came, as Kurt puts it, came almost entirely from him. Some of written recollections from Fritz, but mostly the feeling I got for the family came from Kurt, his recollections.
You come from an academic background. You have written non-fiction books. You've written other novels as well.
Yeah.
And an archaeological background as well.
Yes, I've had quite a meandering career. I mean, the first thing I tried out was archaeology, and I became an academic for a while. I was struggling to find a job after doing my PhD, and I'd always had this instinct for writing narratives, and I started experimenting with fiction. And I managed to write a novel that got published. So there was no looking back from there. And then I moved back into non-fiction, bringing the two lines together. And I think I found my ultimate comfort zone, in a way, because I can bring, with writing narrative non-fiction, I can bring my loves of the past, of academic research, and of storytelling, can all come together in this field.
Has this opened a door for you? I mean, would you write more Holocaust stories?
I would like to, because people have contacted me since the book came out with their family stories, and there are two specific stories that I would love to be able to write. Stories that, in their own ways, are every bit as extraordinary as the story of Gustav and Fritz. But it really pains me to say that I've been kind of discouraged from doing that, because the market, again, it comes back to the market. The market has been, since my book came out, the market has been so saturated with other books that I don't think publishers want to take any new ones.
You could self-publish.
Yeah, I've had a conversation with my publisher, and I haven't closed the door on that. That's something I'm still exploring. At the moment, I'm mainly occupied with writing a screenplay based on The Boy Who Followed. That's a film project, is in the very early stages of development. So I haven't left that story behind at all yet.
So who do you envisage playing Gustav and Fritz?
Well, this is the big question right now, because in order to attract finance to the film, you need to attach a big name actor to play the lead role. And of course, Fritz is it's kind of the most important role in the film, but Gustav is, what we would call the star role. We are actually looking to try to attach an actor to play Gustav. We have names.
Oh, please drop one at least.
I'm afraid I can't. There's one person in particular that I very, very much want for the role, but we're waiting to hear whether he's interested in doing it.
Did you, by any chance, watch the movie Sobibor?
No, I haven't seen that one.
Because that came out, I think, about 18 months, 2 years ago, and that's about the Russian concentration camp with the uprising there. It's the only successful uprising at a concentration camp.
Yeah.
Well, saying unsuccessful, like they got mowed down as they were running away. But the movie's fantastic. And I mean, one of the things, would you look at it in English, or is it having it done in German with subtitles?
Oh, it's definitely an English language film project if it happens, for an international audience.
Okay. Well, we wish you everything of the best with that. What do you read as a matter of interest? Besides the 20 million Holocaust books behind you.
Yes. Yeah, well, and things, because I read so much professionally, writing is like 90% reading. I tend not to read that much for entertainment these days. I mean, I'm mostly focused on film, really, because that's where I'm heading. And also, I often, when I'm actually working on a writing project, I tend to avoid reading other people's, unless it's something that's necessary for what I'm writing, unless it's research material. I tend to avoid reading other people's work, either non-fiction or fiction, because I'm too easily influenced. This is something I discovered very early in my career as a writer. It took hardly anything to have an influence on the way I write. If I like a piece of writing, like a book, like a piece of writing, then I find myself unconsciously drifting towards that style, that mode of expression. And if you're writing a book, then that's just really destructive. You end up with something incoherent. You lose heart because you lose focus. So I tend to avoid reading while I'm working on something. And since I'm almost always working on something, my reading is unfortunately confined to things that I have to read for research.
I can recommend some really good South African novels for you if you like. I'll send you an email with those. David Johnson wants to know what you're working on now, but you've answered that in terms of a screenplay. And we know where you are in terms of other stories. So I will watch the space and see what's coming next. And we would love to see a movie on this, because I think it would be quite an incredible, very moving kind of story.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions for Jeremy, should we let him go and have his morning tea? There are a couple of comments. So emotional, so sad, a terrible time of life. Thank you for an extremely valuable chat. And you made me cry.
Me too.
Jeremy Dronfield, thank you so much for your time. It's been fabulous chatting to you. We wish you everything of the best.
Thank you.
And everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. If anybody would like the program for next week, it's ready. Please just ask me for it. And have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, and go well, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.